Good afternoon, everybody present here in person. I just got a nice wave from friendly faces. And then those online. I'm Hector Gonzalez. I'm a professor of neurosciences here at UC San Diego, and I also co-direct the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center's Latino core with others. Um, and it's really a delight today to present a friend, colleague, and a really good scientist, Dr. Ariana Stickel, who was a postdoc here at UCSD a couple of years ago and has since then skyrocketed into the stratosphere of success and continues on her rapid ascent to the top. So Dr. Ariana Stickel did her graduate work in clinical psychology at Arizona, University of Arizona in Tucson, and did her postdoc here for a couple of years. Was awarded a Career Development Award, a K08 Clinician Scientist Career Development Award. Also was awarded a first award as part of her packet because she was a very competitive person as well, and is now here to talk about sociocultural considerations and measurement uh, and challenges, drawing from her experience as a clinical psychologist, clinical neuropsychologist in particular, with a special emphasis with Hispanic and Latino persons. So it gives me great delight to present Dr. Ariana Stickel, and without further ado, Dr. Stickel, take it away.
Thank you, Hector. That was a really good memory. I'm impressed. Yes, it's a full 30. All right. So Hector gave you a little bit of background about me, and I'm going to reiterate some of that throughout this talk. So in addition to talking about these sociocultural considerations, I'll tell you a little bit about my career path um, and how I got to where I am today. And before we move on, I want to just give some quick disclosures, disclaimers, and those are that I'm going to be using the term Latino throughout this presentation. Some people prefer the term Latinx, Latina, Hispanic. This is just the term I'm using. A lot of our participants prefer Latino or Hispanic, so that's why I generally go with this term. But of course, when you're referring to an individual, go with whatever their preferred term is. And then this talk is really focused about Latino cognitive aging for Latinos who are here in the US. And so it's a very US centric talk. Now, that's not to say that these people aren't coming from different backgrounds. They may have migrated here from different countries, and they might even be going back and forth to different countries to this day. So, as I mentioned, I'll describe my pathway and starting from how I got interested in this talk to just some general background on this topic, not going too much into detail, just some brief statistics on why I think you should care about Latino cognitive aging. And then we'll go into my contributions to this area and my path. So first, I'll discuss my motivation. So here we have my son, Julio. He's here and here, and he's here with his two great grandmas. So this is his great grandma on his dad's side, and this is my grandma, his great grandma. And my motivation always stems from my grandmother. If you've heard me give any talk about how I got interested in psychology in the first place, it always stems from her. But I did want to just acknowledge his other great grandma. She passed away on Christmas Eve this past year. And so I thought it was important to do that. But also, when I think about her, she is polar opposite, or she was polar opposite to my grandma. She's somebody who is very pleasant, very quiet. Thank you for the heart. And she was pretty independent throughout her life and into her older adulthood. She lived on her own until she passed away. Whereas my grandmother, she is the person that you don't want her to be your patient. She's feisty. She does not have a filter. She'll tell you everything you're doing wrong. But she is very loving, especially to whoever the youngest generation is. When I was her grandchild, when I was much younger, it was my generation. Now that we have great grandchildren, I get the brunt of some of the attitude. But the great grandchildren are now the shining people in her life. Um, and so I think this really highlights the heterogeneity within the Latino community, even within women who are Latinas, older women who are Latinas. And yet there are some other things that they had in common. So both of these individuals had a lot of children. They had their families very close to them throughout their life. And they also had certain cardiometabolic conditions in common, like diabetes, kidney issues. And so a lot of my work looks at both commonalities, but also individual differences in this community. And so that's the short story of my interest in this area. But really, going back to my grandmother in particular, so this is going to take a little bit of time, but bear with me. So when I was younger, she used to actually read tarot cards and predict people's future. She used to have people come from LA, from Tijuana to go to her little house, and she would read their fortunes to them. And so I thought, this is psychology. This is what I want to do. I'm going to take a class on this. And so I went into my first psychology class thinking I'm going to learn how to be like my grandma. I'm going to get formal training in it. And that's not what it was at all. It was far from it. And in fact, my psychology textbook in high school, it said something to the effect of if you believe in astrology, your brain is like the size of, I think they said a walnut or a raisin. And I was like, excuse me. A lot of people in my family like astrology. I believe in astrology. And so it was, it was offensive, but at the same time, I was like, oh, shoot, am I stupid? Like, what is going on here? And despite that, the science in psychology still captivated my interest, and nothing else really did at the time. And so then I started to pursue that as my major in college. I went to college here, well, in San Diego at San Diego State University. And at the time, I didn't know if I wanted to work with kids or older adults. So I started working in a lab that focused on bilingual preschoolers and how they obtain language, acquire language in preschool ages. And so I worked in a lab where we tested preschoolers in Head Start programs across San Diego County and looked at different cognitive development, including language. And at the same time, I was volunteering in an older adult care facility in La Mesa. And that's when I saw dementia for the first time. I saw Alzheimer's disease, I saw Parkinson's disease with dementia, and I was fascinated. I was floored, and I wondered, how would this apply to my grandmother? Because these folks that were here that we were caring for, their families, of course, love them, but my family would never put my grandma in an elderly care home. So what what would this process look like for my grandma and her aging in her home or surrounded by her loved ones? And so being a great student, I tried to look into research on cognitive aging among Latinos, and lo and behold, there wasn't a whole lot out there. And so that's really what propelled me forward into this field. So I know all of you know this already, so this is going to be a very brief background, but when I'm talking about dementia, I'm talking about cognitive aging gone awry. So this is when cognitive decline occurs to the point where somebody can no longer care for themselves independently. And dementia has a huge public health cost. So in 2023 alone, there was over $300 billion worth of unpaid care provided to folks with dementia. And so these are often loved ones who are caring for loved ones or friends who are caring for, special people in their lives and not getting paid for it. This is time that they could be out in the workforce getting money for their own families, but they just can't. And as I alluded to earlier, I said, I can imagine my grandmother living in a residential facility. And right now, as it stands, she is completely dependent on other people. She cannot live independently. And guess who her main caregiver is? My mom. And so this is very relevant to me still to this day and has become even more relevant. And what's scary is that these cost, this is one point of dementia costs alone. This is just the unpaid care piece of it. This isn't the actual other economic components, economic costs of dementia. And so unfortunately, by 2060, the overall total costs of dementia are expected to then go into the trillions. So around over $3 trillion is what's anticipated here. But why should we care about dementia and cognitive aging among Latino adults? Well, they're one of the groups that are going to bear the burden, the most burden of this increase in dementia costs over time. Latino and Black communities are expected to see the steepest inclines in those dementia-related care expenses compared to non-Latino whites. We also know that in the same time period, Latino adults are predicted to have the highest number of increased cases of dementia. And so there's a lot of reason why we want to focus on this community. And it's not just about finding a group that's very at risk, but also understanding why are they more at risk. Yes, some of it is based on population growth over time, but there are also differences in health outcomes, health disparities. And also there are certain risk factors that we see in other groups, even genetic risk factors that just don't apply the same. They don't confer the same amount of risk in Latino adults. And so we need to understand why that is. And so part of this is part of the title of the talk are these sociocultural considerations. But in terms of how this influenced my career goal, I wanted to, again, characterize this risk for dementia and just in general help improve cognitive aging for Latinos. So how do I do this? Well, let's talk about my training. So I had a ton of mentors to help me along the way. In my undergraduate and graduate training, I had several different research mentors who helped me along the way. Those are a lot of them there. You might see some familiar faces. This is Claire Murphy down here. This is Dr. Vera Gutierrez-Cullen, who was part of the Bilingual Children's Lab, Research Lab at San Diego State. Once I started focusing on older adults in research, that's when I started working with Claire Murphy, and I was supported by an NIH training grant that was to Dr. Terry Cronin here to do that work. So I was paid to work in Dr. Murphy's lab, which was enormous. I was able to stop working elsewhere and really focus my time and attention on undergraduate research, which then, bless you, helped me get into a summer research program at UW-Madison with Dr. Wen Lee. She was there at the time. And then that propelled me into my graduate training with Dr. Lee Ryan. And I was also supported by one grant, among others, that was funded by the PI, Dr. Maria Teresa Velez, who has since passed away. But really, again, step one was to learn basic research processes. In my undergraduate and in most of my graduate training, I was not working with Latino populations. I was working with predominantly white populations. But I was saying to myself, I'm going to learn the basic skills now so that later on, when I do get opportunities to work with my population of interest, then I'll be ready to do so. And that's exactly what I did. Like I said, I did undergraduate research here at San Diego State University. And that, again, prepared me to do summer research at UW-Madison. And then eventually I was able to go from San Diego State to the University of Arizona, as Dr. Hector Gonzalez mentioned, to do a doctorate in clinical neuropsychology. And so then that's when I really started focusing on cardiovascular disease risk and brain health. And I was like, okay, I'm developing these skills. I'm itching to apply them to this community that I really care about. It's just around the corner. I know it. I know that once I graduate, after I graduate, I'll be able to do this. But you know what? I didn't even have to wait that long. And first of all, I had a lot of help during this time. These are a lot of my mentors or excuse me, mentees at the University of Arizona who also helped me do a lot of this research and build up my mentoring skills. But then while I was there at the University of Arizona, we hired somebody who was not a cognitive aging researcher, but he was a Latino health researcher, and that's Dr. Ruiz, John Ruiz. And when he came to the department, I was getting ready to do my dissertation. And I thought, well, we have somebody who has this expertise that my mentor doesn't have. Can we combine this so that I can actually do some work on Latino cognitive aging while I'm still a graduate student? And so the third process in this step was just to seize that opportunity. I saw it. I told my mentor, Dr. Lee Ryan, I said, hey, John Ruiz is here. Can we please do some work, something out so that I can study this? And she had known Lee Ryan had known from the very beginning that that was my career goal, was to work with the Latino community. And she was supportive of it because she saw the skills that I had built. She knew I could do this. And so, again, as soon as I saw that opportunity, I was able to seize that opportunity because I had gained those skills. And so I wasn't able to collect a bunch of data or anything like that. But what I did was we went to a couple of different publicly available data sets. So this is the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center, the NAC data set, and the ADNI data set. We took the Latino participants from both of those data sets. We matched them to non-Latino whites, and we matched them on age, sex, and education. And then we started to look at how cardiovascular health was related to brain volumes and cognition in these groups potentially differentially. And I think one of the more interesting findings, and this actually is kind of secondary to my dissertation, but still, I think what was most interesting from this work was that for Latino adults, higher blood pressure was associated with smaller brain volumes, particularly in the precuneus and the medial temporal lobe. So these areas that are very sensitive to early changes in Alzheimer's disease specifically. Whereas in our matched white group, we did not see these associations. And when we had previously looked at just history of hypertension and hypertension medication use, we didn't see these associations. And later on, when I thought about it more, it was most likely because a lot of those Latino adults were not being, their blood pressure was not being treated, and they weren't necessarily diagnosed with it. And so that confounder really kind of disguised what was going on there until we looked at these specific blood pressure measurements. Then we started to see these associations. Now, in a lot of other studies, we probably will see that even among white adults, that higher blood pressure is associated with smaller brain volumes in specific regions. But this was very interesting to us and a pretty robust finding. So that then set me up to do some post-grad work here at UCSD with Dr. Hector Gonzalez. So, that was a relatively small sample size. It was a little over, probably around 150 adults altogether between the Latino and the non-Latino white match group. And so then I was able to gain an opportunity to expand this work into much more representative cohorts of Latino adults, specifically working with Dr. Hector Gonzalez on the study of Latinos investigation of neurocognitive aging, or SOL-INCA, as I'll refer to it from here on out. So I started my postdoc here at UCSD, and these are just a few of the folks who I was working with. You might recognize Kevin, you might not recognize him because his hair looks a little different now, but this was from when he was an undergrad. This is when I worked with him. And so obviously I had to add on the PhD here. I don't know if you're on this call, Kevin, but I was like, oh, I need to update this. And so it's just wonderful to see all these people that I've worked with just flourish on their own. And so I just want to point that out. Now, so again, I'm over here trying to seize these opportunities to really dive into this community and really gain those skills that I want, so that I'm not just doing okay research for my community, but the best research that I can do for this community. And so I'm going to give a little bit of background on the SOL-INCA study and its larger parent study, the Hispanic Community Health Study of Latinos, or HCHS-SOL. So the overall parent study recruited 16,000 Latino adults who are coming from 4 different sites, one here in San Diego, in Chicago, the Bronx, and Miami, and around a little over 4,000 from each of those different sites. And this is a population-based study. So these Latinos that are coming in to test with us, they're representative of the areas that they're coming from. So those 4 areas. And of those folks, anybody who was 45 years or older was invited to do cognitive testing, and over 9,000 people did complete that first time point of cognitive testing. Then about 7 years later, we re-invited those folks that had done the cognitive testing to do a second time point of cognitive testing as part of SOL-INCA. And so we had over 6,000 people at that time return for a second time point of cognitive testing, which is amazing. These numbers are unheard of, especially for underrepresented communities. And from there, we had a smaller group of folks come in and undergo MRI. And this was during the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic. So this is an amazing number too here. So we had around 2,600 folks who, most of them had cognitive testing, um, also underwent MRI, and then now we're wrapping up our third time point of cognitive testing. And when I say we, I mean Dr. Gonzalez and his crew. So this is the amazing study that I get to do a lot of work with. And so some of my initial work was again expanding what I had done in as a graduate student for my dissertation. So looking again at cardiovascular disease risk and brain aging, cognitive aging. And so this is just one study I want to highlight here where we were looking at cardiovascular disease risk specifically based on Framingham risk score. And here, if I can orient you to this graph, we have folks who were at low cardiovascular disease risk in the gray, and then in the blue, and then a little bit behind the blue, it's like a lighter gray. We have those who are at high and medium cardiovascular disease risk. And then on the x-axis, we have age at MRI, and then on the y-axis, we have their total brain volume. So higher values are better. Now, what you can see here as people age, their brain volumes are smaller, and this is cross-sectional data. So it's really at higher ages, we see lower brain volumes, but we see that it's actually exacerbated for those folks who are at medium and high cardiovascular disease risk. And if we take this one cross-section here, we can see that at one point, you can see that folks are basically aging about 7 years more if they're at the higher cardiovascular disease risk. So essentially the brain of this 77-year-old is about the same as somebody who is much younger but has lower cardiovascular disease risk. That's good for them, for that low risk group. That's not good for these folks. You don't want your brain looking 7 years older than it could be. And so, as Dr. Gonzalez mentioned, I have a Career Development Award, a KO8, to study some of this further. And a piece of this is really integrating brain health and physical health, cardiovascular disease risk, but then also incorporating some measures of sociocultural factors. So, what I'm looking at for this is really how does cardiovascular disease risk relate to cognitive impairment? So, this could be dementia or mild cognitive impairment. But how might they, first one, be mediated by small vessel disease? So, these are things like white matter hyperintensities, perivascular spaces, lacunar infarcts, those sorts of things. So, things that are messing up the vasculature in your brain. But also, how might this differ? How might these relationships differ if you are maybe lower in terms of your acculturation, your adoption of Anglo-American standards? And so this is in progress, but I really didn't have a whole lot of work in this sociocultural piece. And that's why I'm going to be talking about some of my work that I've done since then today. So what are these sociocultural considerations that we should take into account for Latinos? Well, there's a lot, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So one is migration. So we have a lot of folks here who have migrated, and there is what we consider recurring migration. A lot of folks in San Diego, especially, go back and forth across the border. They might be living in two different homes at different periods of time. And we also see this for folks who might be coming from Central and South America as well. But it's much more common here. We see it a lot more here. Then we also want to consider the reasons for migration. Are people coming here because they're seeking work, trying to avoid poverty? Are they fleeing persecution? Are they coming here for educational opportunities for themselves or maybe for their kids? These are all different things that we might know if we're talking to somebody at the individual level, but we want to consider also when we're testing these people. So to look at this in more of a very crude basic sense, I wanted to understand how age at migration might be associated with cognitive aging in the Solinka study. And why I focused on age and migration, we don't have a whole lot of information on this in HCHSO or the Solinka study, but we do know when people migrated. And we generally know that if folks migrated here in childhood, so maybe their parents came and, dragged them along when they were a child to the US, we know that they were more likely to get educational opportunities that folks who migrated here at a later age probably didn't get. And so that might confer some benefit to their cognition later on in life. Whereas maybe somebody who migrated in late adolescence, early adulthood, they may have migrated because they had very good cardiovascular health or other good health otherwise overall, and might have come here for work opportunities. And so that might also be beneficial to their cognition later on in life. But these are all our hypotheses. And then folks who migrated later, it might be for completely different reasons. And so what we ended up doing, so this was a collaboration with some folks at Berkeley. I'm going to shout out the co-first author on this paper, Dr. Mao-Mei Liu. It was really, our baby together, but her baby more than anything else. And just to orient you here, what we did was we looked at three different age and migration groups. So those who migrated before the age of 16. So we again think that they might have more educational opportunities than other folks. This group here that migrated between the ages of 16 and 34, we think that they might have migrated more likely for work opportunities. And then folks who migrated at 35 and older, who might have much more varied reasons for their migration history. And so first we wanted to see between these groups and those who were born here in the US, who has better cognitive aging? But then going beyond that, why might there be any differences if there are differences? And lo and behold, we did see differences. So those who were born here in the US had better cognitive aging, and this is cross-sectional and over 2 time points. So a little bit of longitudinal data or cognitive change data there compared to all of these groups. But then when we started to control for different factors, demographic factors, socioeconomic factors, acculturative factors, and self-reported health factors, we no longer saw those differences. So really these differences at age of migration on cognition are really explained by these underlying factors. And we took it a step further to really see which of those factors seem to be most pertinent to explaining that relationship. And so what this shows here in these individual plots are different factors. I have them grouped here: demographics, these are things like age and sex; socioeconomic factors, which are listed here: education, income, occupation, health insurance; acculturation, this is based on the short acculturation scale for Hispanics; and a test of language preference. And then we have self-reported health and health behaviors. These are things like self-reported smoking, TIA, or stroke, other self-reported behaviors related to sleep. And really what came out to be the biggest factors across these groups that was explaining those differences between those who were born here and those who had migrated here were these ones that are highlighted here. And I highlight them in green and blue because they correspond to these 2 bars here. So really it were these socioeconomic and acculturative factors that are explaining those differences. And we see, so this is the percent of variance explained here overall in this kind of coral color. But when you look at the individual factors here, you again see the socioeconomic factors in green and the acculturative factors pop up. And they tend to pop up for all these groups. So those who are born over 35, or who came here over 35, those who came here between 16 and 34, and then those who came here at much younger ages. But the acculturative factor, it seemed to be more important at these 2 older groups. It was less important for those who came here early on. And it's probably because they have more equivalent access to resources to those who were already born here because they came here at such a young age is what we're hypothesizing. Where across all of these groups, but instead in terms of socioeconomic factors, that was a huge player in these differences across all of these groups. So what that tells us is that, one, there's a good policy piece here that if we solve some of these socioeconomic factors, we might improve cognitive aging for folks who are migrants to the US. Now, I wanted to dig a little bit into this acculturation piece more. As I mentioned, it's part of my KO8. So I wanted to see if we take out all that other stuff, what is acculturation doing to cognition? And overall, what we found was, and I'm going to show you here, we have acculturation here on the bottom. And we looked at two different subscales. There's a social subscale. So we asked questions on who do you spend more time with at work, at home? Do they tend to be more people who are Hispanic or Latino or more Anglo-American white people? And in different contexts. And we do the same thing with, oh, my pointer's, okay, there we go. And then we tend to do the same thing. We ask the same questions about different contexts, but related to language use. So what language do you typically use to watch TV? What language do you typically speak at work, at home, those sorts of things. And so this is messing me up. Okay. And so those who are in the lower quadrants of acculturation means that they're less acculturated to Anglo-American standards. So they're doing more things with their peers and or they're speaking a lot more Spanish in the home compared to those who are at the other end of the spectrum. These are the people who are much more acculturated in the Q4, and we split them up into quartiles here. And so on the y-axis for both of these scales are cognitive measures. And so this is an overall global cognition score here. And what we see is that for those who are more acculturated to Anglo-American culture, they are performing better on this overall on our cognitive measures compared to those who are less acculturated. But when we start to look at changes in cognition over time, so who's better at maintaining cognition over a 7-year period, we actually don't really see those differences show up. We do see some slight differences in unadjusted models, but they're not significant in fully adjusted models. And so what we think might be going on here is that these folks who are less acculturated, they're not necessarily more at risk for cognitive decline. What we might be capturing is that they might not be as familiar with our testing environment and test taking in general. Maybe our tests are a little bit more biased for these folks. And so these are questions that we need to consider. And another reason why it's important to consider not just somebody's background or even their age at migration, but how acculturated they might be. And we have to think about how our testing might be underrepresenting their cognitive performance as a result. And so that leads us to, again, think about these measurement challenges. So another big factor that I like to talk about is language. So I mentioned language acculturation a little bit ago, but also we also need to think about bilingualism. So is somebody predominantly English speaking, Spanish speaking, or Portuguese speaking, some other language speaking, or are they more balanced bilinguals, meaning they speak both languages or multiple languages in a relative similar frequency? And if you go into the bilingualism work, it's much more detailed than that. You can think about where people are using languages, when did they start learning their second language, that sort of thing. So that's not what I'm focusing on here. Instead, I want to talk about, related to measurement challenges, how does the language of testing, regardless of how bilingual someone is, just how does the language that they are tested in impact their cognitive scores on our tests? And so we know that folks who are tested in Spanish tend to score lower than those who are tested in English. We're just talking about Latino adults here. We're not even comparing them to non-Latino whites. But does that mean that those folks who are tested in Spanish, are they at higher risk for cognitive decline, for dementia? What's going on with them? Is that actually something that we should be worried about in terms of their cognitive health? And so to answer this, my lab and we looked at data from the NAC data set again. We looked at how folks changed in their cognitive scores over time across a few different cognitive domains. We have a memory domain, executive function, language, and we call this attention and working memory here. And so in the red here, we have those who were tested in English, and in the blue, we have those who were tested in Spanish. And what you'll notice is that overall, for a lot of these, except with the exception of language, we tend to see that those who are tested in English, like we said, they tend to do better overall. But when we look at the rate of decline over time, we see that they're very similar rates of decline. And so this suggests that folks who are tested in Spanish, they're not more at risk for cognitive decline than those who are tested in English. And in fact, what we saw for this attention and working memory measure was the opposite, that they actually maintained their cognition in this domain better over time compared to those that were tested in English. Now, there could be several different reasons for that. They might have started a little lower. They were not completely on the floor, so to speak, when it comes to cognitive testing. But they seem to be doing better over time, which means maybe that, again, there might be some unfamiliarity with our testing that they just show better improvements over time and better, and it looks like better maintenance over time. But there could be other reasons too. And again, I want to shout out folks in my lab here. This is my doctoral student in the clinical psychology program. And you might have recognized him. He's worked at the ADRC for quite a while with Matt Panazon. He worked with Aaron Sunderman, Sarah Banks, and Carlos is amazing. And then the other people that helped lead this work were Ruby Carpio, who is now a graduate student at the University of Arizona, and then Alyssa Harris, who is my master's student. And shameless plug, she's applying for doctoral programs right now, UCSD Neurosciences. Hit her up. But they did amazing work on this, and it was published in Alzheimer's and Dementia this past year. And and so that was a question that was important to us, but then it made us really think again, is there testing bias in our measures for those who are tested in English versus those who are tested in Spanish? Are our tests biased against those who are tested in Spanish? Is really what we want to know. And Carlos, he actually had to do a psychometric evaluation for one of his classes. And he actually came up with this idea based on some of our other discussions about language differences. And so he wanted to test for this bias. Does it seem like certain tests are measuring the same thing in English and in Spanish? And what we did was we took so these are different tests that are given that are commonly given in the NAC data set. Some of you probably are very familiar with these. And we based this off of factor analysis that was done in the NAC data set using these same tests in Hayden et al. And so we wanted to see if this factor structure held for those who were tested in English and those who were tested in Spanish. And this original factor analysis, the exploratory factor analysis on this, actually found they included Latino adults, but only those who were tested in English. So we have no idea. We had no idea how this was going to work out. And so when you're trying to decide if these measures are invariant, meaning that they measure the same thing across these two different groups, we look at different levels of this, and we looked at 3 different levels. The configural level, which means altogether, these tests are broadly measuring the larger concept of cognition. Then we look at individual cognitive domains and say, okay, collectively, do these tests seem to properly represent processing speed and executive function? Do these tests collectively seem to measure memory in these 2 groups, English versus Spanish, tested similarly? Then we go down to the scalar level and see, does it seem like any one test alone seems to be inappropriately harder for one group versus another, when other things are held constant, like age, education, that sort of thing. And so at the largest level, the configural level, yes, these tests in general did hold that they were generally measuring cognition similarly for those who were tested in English as those who were tested in Spanish. And then when we break it down to cognitive domains, we found that for this processing speed executive function domain, which was really just trail A and trail B, that was different between these 2 groups. So it seemed like these tests really weren't measuring the same domain for those Spanish test takers as it was for English test takers. And when in the test that was giving us the most trouble, that was really throwing it off the most, was trail B. So when we take out trail B and look at some other pieces of information there, then we see that it becomes more balanced across those 2 groups. And then when we looked at the individual test level, the scalar level, that's when we saw that again, Trails B is giving us trouble. It's unnecessarily, unfairly harder for our Spanish folks than our Spanish tested folks than their English tested folks. And surprisingly, the Mint was too. And this is, if you're not familiar with the Mint, this is a vocab test. So you see pictures and you have to name them. So confrontation naming. And Trail B, I think most people are familiar with that test where you're connecting the dots between numbers and letters alternating. It's a task switching task. And so again, it makes us think there, so we have some evidence that there's testing bias here. But what can we do about this? We've seen that these different sociocultural factors are associated with cognitive aging, differential cognitive aging outcomes for Latino adults. But what do we do? How do we just keep giving the same test? Do we change our tests? We've been giving these tests for a long time. What is the solution? What can we do? Well, there are a few different things we can do. One, we can develop better normative data. So instead of, looking at normative data that says, okay, this is the cutoff point where the Latinos are impaired or not impaired, we need to go a little more granular. We might need to say, okay, well, this is the cutoff point. Maybe if you migrated here when you were 16, but maybe if you migrated here when you're 35, maybe there's a different cutoff point we need to use. Or if you were tested in English versus if you were tested in Spanish, those cutoff points might be different. And we don't want to look at any one of these factors individually. We want to get to a point where we're integrating these all together and doing more of a regression-based approach, which is something that Hector and I had done quite a long time ago with Jordi Berthon, who's now a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. And so we did this with the brief Spanish English verbal learning test where we developed norms that you can put information on all these different factors. So age, sex, education, the language they were tested in, and even their heritage background. So Dominican, Puerto Rican, Mexican, that sort of thing. And so you get much more personalized norms and appropriate norms for any given person. And we hope that they're more accurate and more robust than other normative data. They are more accurate and more robust than other data. So that's one potential solution to this. And, this was one of the first ones that we did with Sol Inca, but Dr. Morlet Paredes here at UCSD, she's done a lot of this work too now, taking some other tests in Sol Inca and developing this normative data calculator for them as well. But outside of that, we just do need to think about developing better tests. So how can we make trails be more appropriate for a wider range of people? What can we do about that? And one thing that I didn't mention is in that invariance in this work, let me see how we're doing it. Oh, we're doing good on time. In this work, what we did as a secondary analysis was we actually matched these groups exactly as we could on education. And when we did that, we actually saw that some of these non-invariants disappeared, meaning that these tests did look more appropriate for our folks. So this suggests again that now education is playing a big role in how people are performing, but also how biased these tests are. So that leads us to believe that we can probably do better at developing tests for folks who are at lower education levels, because those who are tested in Spanish tend to be much lower education than those who are tested in English. Yes, we could do better about increasing education for folks, but we need to do both at the same time. We're never going to get rid of, lower education levels among a huge population. So we need to think about this more seriously when we're developing tests. And then outside of this, we need to think about other factors that we're not accounting for. Again, I only talked about two sociocultural factors that we should take into account. There's so many more. And there's so many things that we miss as researchers that our communities are telling us about or would tell us about if we gave them our time and attention. And so we need to think about looking at the perspectives of the community through community-based participatory research and through qualitative data work. And some of my work that I didn't present on at all here is related to hearing loss and hearing aid use in the Latino community. And so a lot of that work is mixed methods work where we're combining qualitative information with objective cognitive data. So we're trying to figure out from the qualitative work, why are folks in the Latino community not using hearing aids? What are the barriers to accessing hearing aid health, or is there stigma associated with using hearing aids? What is preventing people from using them? And you'll be able to hear more about that when Dr. Laura Coco speaks in a future Lunch and Learn. So a heads up for that. But that is those are some ways that we can incorporate qualitative work into our cognitive aging research. So with that, I want to say thank you to my lab, the Brilla Lab. These are the folks, our current batch of folks here. Dr. Hector Gonzalez and Wasim Taraf were my huge mentors, postdoc and beyond. And this is our support from NIH here. So thank you all, and thank you to my mentors throughout my training. I didn't talk about my work on sex differences, but that's also a part of my KOA. Dr. Sarah Banks here is a big part of that. Linda Gallo is a big mentor for a lot of this work, especially the sociocultural pieces. So big shout outs to them too. And thank you.